There are places on this earth where the soil has been so thoroughly saturated with anguish that the ground itself seems to reject the living. These are locations where history is not merely written in books or archived in dusty libraries, but is etched into the stone walls in scratches of desperate fingernails and the residual echoes of screams that have no mouth to scream them. We like to believe that when a human life ends, the energy dissipates, returning to the ether or moving on to a judgment beyond our comprehension. But there is a darker possibility, one supported by centuries of documented terror and the shattered minds of those who have witnessed the impossible. The possibility is that some agony is too heavy to float away. It sinks, it settles, it waits. Welcome to Nocturnal Ledger. What you are about to hear is not a campfire tale spun for cheap thrills. It is a chronicle of documented suffering, historical fact, and eyewitness testimony regarding a structure that stands today in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It is a stone leviathan that was designed to save souls, but ended up crushing minds. We are entering the cold, echoing corridors of Eastern State Penitentiary. To understand the haunting, one must first understand the horror of the living history. For ghosts are rarely born of peace. They are born of trauma, and few places in the history of the United States have manufactured trauma with such industrial efficiency as Eastern State. When the massive iron gates of Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829, it was hailed as a technological and philosophical marvel. Designed by the architect John Haviland, it was the most expensive public building in the United States at the time. It was designed to look terrifying from the outside, with faux medieval towers, slit windows, and imposing gargoyles intended to strike fear into the hearts of the citizens of Philadelphia. But the true terror was the philosophy within. This was not a jail in the traditional sense. It was the world's first true penitentiary. The word itself comes from penitence. The founders, including members of the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, believed that crime was a moral disease caused by social interaction. Their cure was isolation, absolute, crushing, impenetrable isolation. This was the birth of the Pennsylvania system. Inmates were not just locked away, they were erased. When a prisoner arrived, a heavy hood was placed over their head. They were led blindly to their cell, ignorant of the layout of the prison, ignorant of who was in the cell next to them, ignorant of the world they were leaving behind. Once the heavy wooden doors slammed shut, followed by the clanking of the iron gate, they were alone. For 23 hours a day, they sat in a cell with nothing but a Bible. The only light came from a single, narrow skylight in the vaulted ceiling, referred to as the Eye of God. It was meant to remind them that they were always being watched by the Almighty, urging them toward repentance. In reality, it became a mocking spotlight on their descent into madness. They were forbidden to speak. They were forbidden to sing. Guards wore socks over their shoes to patrol silently. The delivery of food was done through a feeding slot with mechanical precision to avoid human contact. The silence was weaponized. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. But the human mind is a social instrument. When deprived of all contact, it begins to cannibalize itself. Historical records from the 1830s and 40s detail the rapid mental deterioration of the inmates. Wardens reported prisoners staring catatonically at the walls, speaking in tongues to invisible companions, or weeping uncontrollably for hours until their voices gave out. And when the silence failed to break them, the punishments began. This is where the haunting energy of Eastern State finds its root. We have official logs detailing the torture methods used to enforce the rule of silence. There was the iron gag. This device was clamped onto the prisoner's tongue and chained to their wrists, which were strapped behind their back. If the prisoners struggled against the chains, the iron mechanism would tear into the muscle of the tongue, filling their mouth with blood and silencing them through agonizing pain. There was the mad chair. Inmates were strapped so tightly into a heavy chair that their circulation was cut off. They were left there for days, without food or water, sitting in their own filth. In the winter, the limbs would turn black from frostbite and lack of blood flow. Many men went into the chairs sane and came out with their minds shattered, never to speak a coherent sentence again. There was the water bath. In the dead of the Pennsylvania winter, inmates were taken out to the yard, stripped naked, and doused with buckets of ice water before being chained to a walls overnight. By morning, a layer of ice would have formed on their skin. Those who survived often succumbed to pneumonia days later, coughing their lungs out in the lonely dark of their cells. And then there was the hole, Block 13. Deep beneath the prison, these cells had no eye of God. They had no light at all. It was a stone tomb where men were thrown to rot in total darkness, with meager rations and the company of rats and roaches. Thousands of men and women died within these walls. They died of disease, of suicide, of murder at the hands of other inmates after the solitary system was finally abandoned due to overcrowding in 1913. But the energy of that original suffering, the decades of forced silence and psychological torture, had already soaked into the limestone. The prison closed its doors in 1971, leaving the structure to rot. Trees grew inside the cell blocks. The skylights shattered. The paint peeled away in layers like dead skin. But almost immediately, reports began to surface that the prison was not empty. Caretakers, urban explorers, and eventually paranormal investigators began to document phenomena that defied explanation. These were not vague feelings of unease. These were physical, auditory, and visual confrontations with the entities that remain. One of the most compelling and terrifying accounts comes from a man named Gary Johnson. This is not a legend. This is a first-hand testimony from a locksmith who was hired in the early 1990s to help restore the crumbling locks of the old cell gates. Gary was a skeptic. He was a working man, focused on rust and tumblers, not ghosts and ghouls. He was working in Cellblock 4. The atmosphere in Block 4 has always been described as particularly oppressive. Visitors often report sudden migraines or nausea the moment they step across the threshold. Gary was working on a lock, trying to free a mechanism that had been seized by 50 years of corrosion. He was alone in the block. The only sound was the scraping of his tools and his own breathing. Suddenly, he felt a change in the air pressure. It wasn't just a draft. It was a physical weight, as if the air had turned to water. He described an intense feeling of being watched, a primal alarm bell ringing in his hindbrain. He looked down the long, vaulted corridor. It was empty. Sunlight filtered through the dusty skylights, illuminating the debris on the floor. He turned back to the lock. Then, he realized he couldn't move. It wasn't that he was paralyzed by fear. He physically could not move his body. He described a sensation of icy, electric energy wrapping around him. And then, he saw them. In the cell he was working on, looking out through the bars, He saw faces, not transparent, misty apparitions, but tormented, solid-looking faces, distorted, anguished. He said it looked like a negative of a photograph. Darkness where there should be light, light where there should be shadow. They were screaming, but there was no sound. The force of their silent screaming seemed to hit him like a physical shock wave. Gary Johnson, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, was thrown backward by an unseen force. He didn't trip, he was launched. He landed hard on the concrete floor. When he looked up, the faces were gone. He packed his tools and left immediately. He has recounted this story with shaking hands to anyone who asks. He knows what he saw. He knows that in Cellblock 4, the barrier between the living and the dead is paper thin. But Gary is just one of many. The roster of witnesses includes police officers, tourists, and hardened skeptics. Let us discuss the case of Al Capone. The infamous gangster spent 8 months in Eastern State Penitentiary in 1929 on a concealed weapons charge. His cell is often displayed today as a luxury suite, complete with rugs, paintings, and a radio. But the luxury was a facade. Capone was living in hell. During his stay, other inmates and guards reported hearing Capone screaming in his cell at night. He wasn't screaming for the guards. He was screaming at someone named Jimmy. He would be heard begging, pleading for Jimmy to leave him alone. Historical context tells us that prior to his incarceration, Capone was involved in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. One of the victims was a man named James Clark. It is widely believed by historians of the occult that the spirit of James Clark followed Capone into the isolation of Eastern State. Deprived of his entourage, his bodyguards, and the distractions of his criminal empire, Capone was left alone in the silence with the ghost of his victim. Even after his release, Capone reportedly hired mediums to try and banish the spirit of James Clark. But while he was inside those walls, the torment was relentless. The stone walls of Eastern State acted as an amplifier for the haunting, trapping the gangster and the ghost in a feedback loop of fear and vengeance. The auditory evidence collected at Eastern State is among the most compelling in the field of paranormal research. We are not talking about static that might be a voice if you squint your ears. We are talking about Class A electronic voice phenomena. In the early 2000s, a team of investigators from the Sci-Fi Channel's Ghost Hunters conducted one of the first major televised investigations of the site. During their walkthrough, they captured footage that has become a cornerstone of paranormal evidence. In the footage, a small, black, humanoid shape is seen clearly darting across the walkway in the upper tiers of the cell block. It moves with a fluidity that no human could replicate, disappearing into a wall. But the sounds are far worse. Visitors to Cell Block 12 often report hearing a cackling laughter. It is described as manic, wet, and echoing from cells that are clearly empty. There is no ventilation system to carry voices from other parts of the prison. The laughter is localized. It sounds like a man who has lost his mind, laughing at a joke only he can understand. In the medical wing, the atmosphere shifts from aggressive to mournful. The medical wing was where the sick and the dying were sent, often to receive treatments that were little more than experimentation. Here, investigators have recorded the distinct sound of crying. Not the soft sobbing of a child, but the deep, heaving wails of grown men. One particularly chilling recording captured in the infirmary contains a voice whispering a single word: help. The voice is breathless, strained, as if coming from a throat that has been crushed or a lung that is filled with fluid. We must also consider the shadow people. This is a phenomenon reported by the guards who worked there until 1971 and by the tour guides who work there today. The guard towers at Eastern State are high, lonely perches. Guards would spend 8-hour shifts staring down into the spoke-like layout of the prison. In the later years of the prison's operation, guards would request transfers to avoid the night shift in Tower 4. They reported seeing silhouette figures standing on top of the cell blocks, defying gravity, watching them. One guard, in a report filed in the 1960s, claimed to have seen a shadow figure walking toward him along the perimeter wall. He drew his weapon and ordered the intruder to halt. The figure continued to approach, silent and featureless. As the guard prepared to fire, the figure simply dissolved into the air like smoke in a strong wind. The guard refused to return to that post. Today, tourists frequently report seeing fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision. You turn your head, expecting to see another person, but there is only a crumbling wall and a rusted bed frame. The sensation is always accompanied by a drop in temperature. This brings us to the science, or the attempt at science, behind these phenomena. Skeptics argue that the layout of the prison, with its vaulted ceilings and long concrete corridors, creates infrasound. Infrasound is a low-frequency sound wave, below the range of human hearing, that can cause feelings of nausea, dread, and even visual hallucinations. They argue that the wind blowing through the broken skylights creates these frequencies, turning the prison into a giant sensory deprivation tank that tricks the brain. They also point to the mold and the dampness, suggesting that toxic spores could be causing mild hallucinations. But these theories fail to explain the specificity of the encounters. Infrasound does not create the same face of a screaming man for a locksmith in 1990 and a tourist in 2010. Mold does not result in multiple audio recorders capturing the same voice saying the same name at the same time. There is a theory in the paranormal community known as the stone tape theory. It suggests that high emotional events, torture, murder, intense grief, can be recorded onto the environment. Crystalline materials like quartz and limestone, which make up the bulk of Eastern State's construction, are theoretically capable of holding this energy. When you walk through Eastern State, you are not just walking through a building. You are walking through a recording. You are walking through the playback of 10,000 nervous breakdowns. The walls have absorbed the screams of the iron gag. The floor has absorbed the shivering of the men in the water bath. The air is thick with the despair of the solitary confinement cells. The haunting is not just about ghosts. It is about residue. Let's go deeper into the experience of the location as it stands today. If you were to visit Eastern State Penitentiary now, the first thing you would notice is the smell. Even with the doors open and the tours running, there is an underlying scent of wet rot, old iron, and something metallic, like copper or dried blood. It is the smell of a building that has died but hasn't been buried. As you walk down the long corridors, the acoustics are disorienting. Your own footsteps echo back to you, but they sound slightly out of sync, as if someone is walking just a step behind you. In Cellblock 15, known as Death Row, the energy is violent. This was the block where the most dangerous inmates were housed in the final years of the prison. It was here that riots were plotted and murders were carried out. Visitors to death row often report being pushed or shoved. Invisible hands feel like they are pressing against your chest or your back. There is a palpable aggression here. It is not the sorrow of the medical wing. It is pure, unadulterated rage. There's a specific cell in Block 15 that many tour guides avoid. They recount stories of feeling a hand wrap around their ankle as they walk past. One guide reported being scratched, finding 3 distinct red welts on their arm after feeling a burning sensation. This physical interaction suggests that whatever resides in Eastern State is not merely a recording. It is active, it is conscious, and it does not like visitors. We must also look at the documented reports from the era of the prison's operation regarding the madness of the whole. The solitary cells in the basement were used to punish those who broke the rules. But the logs show that men sent to the hole often came back talking about the people in the dark. At the time, the prison doctors dismissed this as delirium caused by isolation and lack of food. But the descriptions were remarkably consistent. Inmates separated by years and who had never spoken to one another described the same entities in the darkness. They described the watchers, tall, thin figures that would stand in the corners of the pitch-black cells, whispering secrets and urging them to hurt themselves. Was this merely the brain misfiring in the absence of light? Or is the darkness of the underground cells a doorway? When you strip away all light, all sound, and all human contact, do you open a person up to seeing what is always there, lurking just beyond our perception? The tragic irony of Eastern State Penitentiary is that it was built on a foundation of good intentions. The Quakers and reformers who conceived it believed they were building a machine for redemption. They believed that silence would bring men closer to God. Instead, they built a machine that stripped men of their humanity and left them vulnerable to the darkest corners of their own psyches. They created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into that silence rushed madness, despair, and perhaps something from the other side. The sheer volume of evidence cannot be ignored. We are talking about thousands of independent reports over a span of nearly 50 years since the prison closed. We are talking about photographs showing mists forming into human shapes. We are talking about thermal imaging cameras capturing heat signatures in the shape of human bodies sitting on cold metal cots, only to fade away when approached. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence involves a thermal video captured in the Cellblock known as the Klondike. The Klondike was a punishment block built into the yard. It was cramped, hot in the summer, and freezing in the winter. In the video, a heat signature is seen crouching in the corner of a cell. As the investigator approaches, the heat signature stands up and moves through the solid concrete wall. The temperature in the cell at that moment dropped 20 degrees in 3 seconds. What happens to a human soul when it is crushed under the weight of such systemic cruelty? If the spirit survives death, does it retain the trauma of its final years? The evidence at Eastern State suggests that the answer is a terrifying yes. The entities here are not floating through walls in long white gowns. They are crouching in corners. They are pacing their cells. They are screaming for Jimmy. They are reliving the torture of the iron gag and the water bath. They are trapped in a perpetual loop of the very punishment that was supposed to save them. And they are not alone. There is a pervasive belief among the staff that something else resides in the prison. Something that was never human. Something that was attracted to the suffering like a shark to blood. This non-human entity is often blamed for the darker, more violent encounters in the lower levels and the guard towers. It is described as a shadow darker than the surrounding night, a void that absorbs the light around it. When you leave Eastern State Penitentiary, the feeling does not immediately dissipate. Many visitors report a lingering sense of sadness or anxiety that lasts for days. It is as if the dust of the prison sticks to your aura. You carry a piece of the silence home with you. As we conclude this entry in the Nocturnal Ledger, we are left with the chilling realization that stone and iron are not just building materials. They are containers. Eastern State Penitentiary stands today not just as a museum of prison history, but as a monument to the failure of the human experiment in forced isolation. It is a place where the living walk through the corridors of the dead, snapping photos and recording voices, trying to peek behind the curtain. But perhaps we should be careful what we look for. Because at Eastern State, the eyes that watch you from the dark are not always the eyes of the past. They are present, they are aware, and they are waiting for the lights to go out. The gargoyles on the outer walls were meant to keep evil out. But looking at the history, the torture, and the madness that brewed within, one has to wonder if they were actually keeping the evil in. This has been a file from the Nocturnal Ledger. The prison is empty of prisoners, but it is full of occupants. Next time you find yourself in silence, listen closely. You might just hear the weeping of a soul that has been waiting 100 years for someone to acknowledge its pain. Or perhaps you will hear the click of a lock, turning in a door that has no key. Sleep well, if you can.